We are going to talk today about the teams that have the easiest playoff schedule in fantasy football. At number 7, we have the Saints. They do face the Panthers in Week 15. That's been a tougher matchup than a lot of people would think. The Panthers have actually been really good against wide receivers. But in Week 16, they get the Jets. And in Week 17, they get the Titans. At number 6, we have the Dolphins, who get the Steelers in Week 15. The Steelers are giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers and the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends. The Bengals in Week 16, they're giving up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the most fantasy points to running backs, and the most fantasy points to tight end. Week 17 is a little bit tougher. The Buccaneers at home, who are about middle of the pack, maybe a little bit above average in just about every position they're giving up fantasy points to. At number 5, we have the Browns. Week 15 at the Bears. The Bears defense has not been very good. They're allowing the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 9th most fantasy points to running backs, and they're slightly below average against wide receivers and tight ends. They play the Bills in Week 16, who are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. They've actually been a good defense against the rest of the positions, and then they get the Steelers in Week 17. At number 4, the Patriots. Week 15 against the Bills, who we've mentioned have been really bad against running backs. Week 16 against the Ravens, and the Ravens have been terrible. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs, and the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, and they've been about middle of the pack against tight ends. And then the Jets, they get in Week 17, and we've talked about them. At number 3, 49ers. 49ers get the Titans in Week 15, the Colts in Week 16, who the Colts are giving up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers and tight ends, allowing the 12th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, have been stingy against running backs, allowing the 26th most fantasy points to running backs. But then they get the Bears in Week 17, the 2nd best schedule for fantasy football, the Minnesota Vikings. They get the Cowboys in Week 15, and the Cowboys have been the best defense to play against in fantasy football. The Cowboys are allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 5th most fantasy points to running backs, and the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers. They get the Giants in Week 16, and the Giants have been almost as bad as the Cowboys. They're allowing the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, and the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And then they get the Lions in Week 17. So you get the indoor environment. The Lions are giving up the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers, the 10th most to quarterbacks, and the team with the best fantasy football schedule to target is the Commanders. They get the Giants in Week 15. They get the Eagles in Week 16. The Eagles are allowing the 9th most fantasy points to running back, and they've been mid against the quarterback and wide receiver position, and they're good against tight ends. In Week 17 in the fantasy playoffs, they get the Cowboys, and we all know what that means. A lot of fantasy points.